Dallas McCarver was an American bodybuilder who died at just 26 years old on August 22nd, 2017. I've been interested in Dallas for a number of years, mainly because his tragic loss of life could have been avoided, and also because it provides a really important lesson about androgen exposure, bodybuilding, the fitness industry, and potentially some unrealistic goals that are set in magazines and on social media, where people will put their health at risk in order to reach goals. The tragedy is that Dallas had so much to contribute to bodybuilding still. He was up and coming, he was winning shows, he was doing well, he had a big social media following, and yet it all went when he died tragically on that fateful night. In this video, I want to explain medically what happened to Dallas McCarver so that we can take some lessons about this industry and about bodybuilding forward. If he can't contribute through bodybuilding anymore, I think he can contribute from wherever he is through teaching us about the lessons of his life and the risks that he took. Dallas was born in 1991, and at just 21 years old, he turned pro. He won 3 out of his first 5 IFBB pro shows from 2012 to 2015. And in 2015, he placed 13th at the Mr. Olympia, and the very next year in 2016, he placed 8th. By all accounts, Dallas was poised to make it in bodybuilding. He was successful, he was getting a big following, and he was doing really well. He was winning shows, and there was no reason to believe that he wasn't just going to continue to grow and be successful in bodybuilding. I'm going to start in 2017, where Dallas flew out to New Zealand to compete in the March 11, 2017 IFBB New Zealand Pro Show, where he came second to Brandon Curry. Just 7 days later, he was competing at the March 18, 2017 Arnold Classic in Melbourne, Australia, where he collapsed on stage. This was very concerning and very frightening for a lot of people in the fitness industry. I'm going to play the video now, and you can see just how concerning and frightening this looks from a medical standpoint. Now, he made it back to the United States on March 24, where Redcon 1, his sponsors at the time, uploaded a video with him explaining his health and what happened in Australia, how he was feeling and what he'd been diagnosed with. In this video, he essentially says that he was diagnosed with asthmatic bronchitis. He was then put on nebulizer therapy with albuterol and prednisone, which actually, interestingly, has been shown to worsen hypertension and dyslipidemia, and this will become very relevant later when we look at his autopsy. Now, I'm going to play a few clips from this video that became very, very interesting in retrospect when we look back at how he died.
And I can assure you that nobody takes my health and safety more serious than me.
Of course.
You know, I get my blood work done every 90 days, you know this.
Yeah.
Saying like,
you knew something was really wrong.
I was scared, man.
Yeah, scared,
I
right?
live alone,
yeah.
And I didn't need to go home. I mean, what happens? I died home. Ran all kinds of tests. They ran blood work, kidney function, piss test, EKG, ultrasound, everything.
And the result was?
Everything came back fine. And I'm going to see a cardiologist just to make sure everything's fine there, even though they told me it was. I want to go see one for me.
The interesting thing about these clips is that by all accounts, Dallas was on top of his health. He was being proactive about his health. He was taking a forward step to make himself healthier and get his bodybuilding career back on track. And by all accounts, these comments seemed like Dallas was in good health and nothing was that wrong with him. And yet, just 5 months later, on August 22nd at midnight in 2017, Dallas was found dead in his living room. So what happened? I wanted to find out medically exactly what happened to Dallas and look at it from a medical standpoint and a physiology standpoint. The first finding we see on his autopsy report was that he had an enormous heart. A normal heart is about 250 to about 350 grams in a male, and he had a heart that was 833 grams. That is almost 3 times as big as a normal male's heart. He had severe concentric left ventricular hypertrophy. We know that steroid users have a higher left ventricle wall thickness and a greater mass of their left ventricle as a result of their steroid use. This can induce electrical remodeling in the heart. There are two subunits that exist that control potassium in the heart and control the potassium current and the way it flows through the heart. These are called Kv 1.4 and Kv 4.3. In rat studies, anabolic androgenic steroids have down-regulated the ability for these subunits to effectively pass potassium through. And the consequences were that in the rats, the anabolic androgenic steroid group had a longer action potential duration and a prolonged QT interval, which strongly contributed to the rats developing electrical arrhythmias and disturbances in their left ventricle. There were some rats that also induced sudden cardiac death as a result of their steroid use because of the lack of ability for the electrical current and the wave of depolarization to successfully pass through cardiomyocytes. The science also tells us that anabolic androgenic steroid use has a really strong and potent ability to activate the sympathetic nervous system, and it was found that anabolic androgenic steroid users had a decreased ability to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, so they could not induce a relaxant tone in their body, which led to postmortems in anabolic androgenic steroid users showing that they had a high degree of tissue necrosis, so actual heart tissue necrosis called heart band necrosis, and that they also had a number of electrical disturbances. In the postmortem of Dallas's heart, the medical examiner actually mentions that he had a number of electrical disturbances and conduction abnormalities. This is very interesting and backs up the literature and the science about how steroids influence our heart structure itself. The literature says that myocardial tissue has androgen receptors, and through pressure overload via continual and progressively increased resistance training, cardiac hypertrophy can result because the sarcomeres actually are put in parallel. So they actually build on top of each other in parallel, therefore increasing the thickness of the wall itself, the left ventricle wall. Dallas had both of these going on. He had the anabolic androgenic steroid exposure, which would have binded to his androgen receptors, but he also had his huge volume of training and his heavy lifting. So his heart was just like any other muscle in that it adapted to this training by adding sarcomeres in parallel and increasing the thickness of his wall in order to therefore exert a greater amount of force and pump blood around his body more effectively. And finally, the science says that there might actually be direct cardiotoxic effects of anabolic androgenic steroids on the heart itself. Steroids have been shown to increase cell death and fibrosis of heart tissue, all of which increase electrical disturbances in the heart through arrhythmias and also reduce the diastolic compliance. Basically, Dallas's heart was so thick that he had trouble relaxing it effectively in the cardiac cycle. This was very dangerous because he had a lot of androgen exposure, his sympathetic drive was always high and elevated, and there was so many androgens in his system, and it was this constant transcription and translation in this muscle protein synthesis cycle that didn't just affect his skeletal muscle, but his heart too. The heart is a muscle and it is a contractile tissue. And the reason why he had such a thick heart is because just like his other muscles in his body, it was also big. The second finding was coronary artery atherosclerosis. Steroids increase LDL and they decrease HDL. This is associated with increased coronary artery disease, and they also increase hematocrit, which increases the thickness of your blood and predispose you to clots and thrombus forms. In rats, steroids have been actually found to impair endothelial function and reduce cardiac capillarization, meaning that in rats that have been given steroids, their heart grows to such a thick extent that there are actually less capillaries in that thick tissue and can therefore lead to a lack of oxygen being delivered to that tissue, which increases the risk for electrical disturbances as well as fibrosis and cardiomyocyte death. And essentially this is what happened in Dallas. He had a heart that was about 3 times bigger than normal. A normal male, like I said, was about 250 to 350 grams, and Dallas's was over 800 grams. He had a huge heart. And what happened is his left ventricle was so thick that there was chaos going on. The actual myocytes were most likely disorganized in a huge concentric pressure overload pattern that predisposed him to electrical disturbances on top of his drug use, on top of his atherosclerosis. It was just a disaster waiting to happen. The other findings were that he had heavy lungs, his kidneys had minimal nephrosclerosis, and he had hypertrophy of his kidneys. Interestingly, his liver was huge. I cannot believe that he had a liver that was 4.5 kilos. A normal male's liver is about 1.5 kilos. His liver, by all accounts, was huge. And on top of all this, he had a non-contributing thyroid cancer. All of this, plus cancer. This was a tragedy. And I want to now get into why it happened and how it could have been avoided. So his cause of death was listed as concentric severe left ventricular hypertrophy. Now, in itself, this is not actually a cause of death in that it's not good to have, but it's not a cause of death per se. I would suggest that it was a very, very strong contributing factor alongside his severe coronary artery disease. He had a heart attack. He either had a heart attack or he had some form of arrhythmia that was worsened by the electrical disorganization in his left ventricle, and he might have even had sudden cardiac death. Either way, it was something to do with the left ventricle being so thick alongside the severe atherosclerosis that was present in his coronary arteries. A heart attack or sudden cardiac death. And interestingly, his manner of death was natural. Now, we know that, yes, technically it is natural in that nobody shot him, stabbed him, did anything, or it wasn't an accident. But let's be real, it wasn't natural. This is not normal. The chance of dying at 26 years old because of a heart attack is about 0.3% in males. It is an absolutely tiny, tiny chance of dying of a heart attack at 26 years old. So for him to die at 26 years old, we need to look at how this happened and how he got here. The autopsy itself actually states that he did have an ECG performed on him in March of 2017. This is very, very interesting in the autopsy. It actually states this ECG met the minimum voltage criteria for left ventricular hypertrophy. Now, if we just look at a QRS complex of a normal heart and now a heart that has left ventricular hypertrophy, you can see the huge spikes that is present in the left ventricular hypertrophy patient. The reason for this is that the wave of depolarization is so much greater with that left ventricular wall thickness being so much bigger that the spikes on the ECG chart are so much larger. Now, I'm not sure what doctor would have seen Dallas and would have seen this ECG and would have okayed him to keep training, because if his heart was as big as the autopsy says, as in 833 grams, then this ECG that he had done in March would have shown enormous QRS voltages and definitely would have met the minimum voltage criteria for QRS complex indicative of left ventricular hypertrophy. Now, whether they did try and tell him in March and he didn't listen, or perhaps they didn't emphasize just how serious it was, who knows? And I can't speculate on that. But either way, this ECG in March 2017, it should have been a marker that something was seriously wrong with him. For the guys out there, this is a key learning lesson. If you get an ECG done and there is something wrong, either an echocardiogram, a scan of your heart, or an ECG trace, and there is something wrong, such as this, like Dallas had in March of 2017, it must be an absolutely crucial indicator to get it checked out and to take steps to find out if it is going to harm your life. Now, I'm not sure if Dallas had taken the steps in March that it would have been enough to save his life. Perhaps it was too late, and perhaps the heart disease was so far advanced that it was too late to save him. But I am positive that it would have at least given him a chance to get healthy again and to realize that perhaps bodybuilding just was not for him. We know that just 5 months later, Dallas would be found dead on his floor at midnight as a result of a heart-related incident, whether it be heart attack, an arrhythmia, or sudden cardiac death. I think this ECG was a key moment in time because it seems like the weight of just how important this was not emphasized strongly enough to Dallas. Whether it was him trying to sweep it to the side or somebody else around him, the weight of how important this diagnosis of left ventricular hypertrophy was so crucial and could have been a factor in saving his life. Another really interesting part of this autopsy is that in the medical examiner's report itself, there is a sentence that says he collapsed in 2017, but he never returned to a doctor. Now, this is tragic. Dallas was a good young man, 26 years old, and he never returned to a doctor when his health was in such dire straits. His heart was screaming out and his body was screaming out to stop the androgen exposure and to get healthy and to take the steps to get healthy. But somebody, whether it be Dallas or someone, didn't listen or didn't emphasize to him just how important it was, because he needed to follow up with that doctor. He really did. And the fact that he didn't I think is a key contributing factor in why he died just less than 5 months later. There were also genetics at play. His mother would later go on the record to say that both Dallas's father and his family had a history of heart disease and heart-related deaths. Now, also in the report, another interesting sentence that I found was that on March 20th of 2017, Dallas did go to the emergency room when he came back from Australia for this upper respiratory infection that he apparently had. Now, in the sentence in the report, it actually says he would follow up with the cardiologist. And apparently he did follow up with the cardiologist, because later in the same report, it said that he saw Dr. Martin Bloom. Now, upon researching Dr. Martin Bloom, it shows that he is a cardiologist, yes, and he is associated with a clinic. And there are a number of videos with him explaining hormone replacement, including testosterone replacement, and his actual clinic has a number of services, one of which is testosterone replacement therapy. Now, this is interesting because potentially Dr. Bloom may not have recognized just how much testosterone Dallas was on, including other androgens, or potentially was a bit more lenient towards his androgen exposure as a result of Mr. Bloom himself being a testosterone replacement doctor. He might have taken a slightly more favorable view of Dallas's lifestyle and bodybuilding career.
Practice what you preach. So other than your working out and your Mediterranean diet and whatnot, what other things, services that you offer in the practice do you personally?
Oh, now you're really getting personal now. What do you want me to tell you here? Do you want me to tell you that I take hormones?
I want just whatever you feel comfortable with.
Yes, well, whatever I feel comfortable with.
Yes.
Yes, I do take hormone therapy.
And I don't think any qualified doctor should have been okay with the amount of androgen exposure Dallas was giving himself. If we take a look at his blood and what they found in the autopsy report, we found cannabis and caffeine, but the biggest thing was that his testosterone was at 55,000 nanograms per deciliter. The normal male reference range is anywhere from 300 to 1,000. His testosterone was 55 times higher than normal, and his testosterone to epitestosterone ratio was 130, where 4.0 and under is normal. They also found trenbolone. So this amount of testosterone is crazy. There have been many people on the internet that have speculated just how much Dallas was taking in order to reach 55,000 nanogram per deciliter testosterone levels, or whether it's even real. The fact of the matter is, whether it's real or not, he was on a very, very super physiological dose of androgens. And there are some key learning lessons that we need to take away from his tragic loss of life at just 26 years old. The first thing to know for all of us out there in the fitness industry is that if you are using anabolic androgenic steroids, the first lesson is that you must understand and learn the physiological processes and pathways that are at play. The second thing is to monitor your signs and your body and your symptoms very closely. Dallas had signs. He collapsed on stage in March. That was a key sign that something was wrong with his body, and he had follow-up tests like the ECG that showed that something was wrong with his heart. He didn't follow up on these for whatever reason, and unfortunately just 5 months later he was dead. Perhaps he didn't want to recognize that bodybuilding was not for him, or perhaps he didn't want to stop the huge amount of drug exposure or the diet or the training. But I think there was a way for him to get healthy and potentially live past August of 2017 if he had recognized the signs and symptoms and he had taken steps to get himself healthy. The third learning lesson is that we're not invincible, and our physiology is not so removed from our everyday life that we can ignore our health in order to chase dreams in bodybuilding. Of course, chasing dreams is important. Of course it is. But when it is going to put your health at harm's risk and your life at risk, I don't think anything is worth it more than your life. We have to ask the question, is it really worth it? For Dallas, was it worth losing his life at 26? Nobody can answer that question, and unfortunately, the tragedy is he's not here to answer that question. But for those of us in the fitness industry chasing dreams, please be safe. Please understand the physiological processes. Please understand what happens to your body and what happens to your androgen receptors, your blood pressure, your heart changes, your organ changes, your muscular changes, your joints, your brain changes, everything involved with taking certain substances in order to reach bodybuilding goals, because we know that they're involved in bodybuilding And we know that bodybuilding today is very much about exposure to androgens and about dieting and about hard training. So if you're thinking of chasing these goals, please make informed decisions, understanding the physiology and understanding lessons from people like Dallas about training and about drug exposure. And the final lesson is to keep track of your health. So understand what biomarkers you need to keep track of, what endpoints you are trying to achieve, and don't be so naive to think that it may not happen to you. Body physiology does not discriminate, and what you put into your body will, with small variations from target populations, recognize it and act upon what you give it. In terms of goals in the bodybuilding industry, understand the physiological processes that are at play, and especially how your body is going to change. Set reasonable goals and reasonable fitness targets, and please keep on top of your health, monitor your health, understand your decision, understand the complex and intricate physiological pathways that are at play when you introduce certain substances to reach bodybuilding or powerlifting or CrossFit or professional sport goals. So please understand it and please stay safe. And we can take a very valuable learning lesson from Dallas McCarver. So we wish that he rests in peace. And all we can do out of this whole tragedy is take what we can from it. And what we can take from it is the learning lessons that he's given us about physiology, about heart changes, and about steroids in today's bodybuilding world, especially in relation to death, organ death, and tissue damage. Today's fitness industry is very much about looks and about goals and about the end point. But a lot of people forget that getting to the end point might just put your health at harm's way. And I want to advocate that the end point is not as important as living. Thank you.